What if I told you that humanity once came within mere hours, perhaps even minutes, of nuclear annihilation? This wasn't the plot of a Hollywood thriller. It wasn't the fever dream of some dystopian screenplay. It was real, an event so dramatic it left the world trembling on the very edge of destruction. And if you'd lived through those 13 days in October 1962, you'd never forget it. For a moment, let's rewind the clock. To understand the full magnitude of the Cuban Missile Crisis, we need to start years before those ominous days. New Year's Day, 1959. In the shadowed streets and open fields of Cuba, the world shifts. A revolutionary named Fidel Castro overthrows the regime of Fulgencio Batista, a ruler propped up by the United States for nearly a decade. Batista's rule had been marked by corruption and growing opposition, and Castro's army of guerrillas quickly won the hearts and minds of Cubans hungry for change. The spectacle of liberation, so close to American shores, caught the world's attention. But Castro's victory, and his subsequent rise to power, was only the beginning. At first, Castro's ideology wasn't yet certain. In his earliest days, he kept his cards close. He wasn't a declared communist, and some U.S. observers hoped he'd be a nationalist, not an outright enemy. But as months unfolded, relations soured swiftly. The U.S. cut off economic ties, and Castro responded by seizing U.S.-owned businesses and opening the doors instead to Soviet overtures. Meanwhile, the superpowers, led by John F. Kennedy in the United States and Nikita Khrushchev in the Soviet Union, were locked in a terrifying Cold War ballet. All across the globe, their rivalry shaped conflicts and alliances. The stakes could not be higher. Both nations possessed unprecedented nuclear arsenals. Yet, in 1962, the Soviets faced a dilemma. The United States maintained an enormous lead in deployable nuclear weapons, and had placed Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy, right on the Soviet Union's borders. In contrast, almost none of the Kremlin's missiles could threaten the American heartland. The intensity of the standoff took a new turn in April 1961 when the CIA sponsored a daring invasion at the Bay of Pigs. It aimed to oust Castro, using Cuban exiles as a fighting force. Instead, it ended in disaster, humiliation, and the solidification of Castro's paranoia toward the United States. As smoke cleared from the failed beachhead, Cuba spun further toward the Soviet sphere. The following summer, Kennedy and Khrushchev faced each other in tense meetings at the Vienna summit. The outcome was chilling. Khrushchev, sensing his adversary's youth and inexperience, pushed aggressively. "He beat the hell out of me," Kennedy later admitted, an honest confession from a president facing trials beyond imagination. But diplomacy was only part of the calculus. In the Kremlin, Khrushchev pondered his options: how to even the scales, how to break free of the nuclear straitjacket imposed by NATO alliances and American missiles. The solution seemed almost elegant in its simplicity. If you can't compete by distance, close the gap. Place Soviet missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the coastline of Florida. Castro, for his part, saw the looming threat of another U.S. invasion. After the embarrassment at the Bay of Pigs, only Soviet firepower could guarantee his revolution's survival. So by the summer of 1962, the die was cast. Shipments began. Construction crews toiled in the Cuban heat, assembling silos and camouflaging deadly cargo. SS-4 medium-range ballistic missiles, deadly enough to incinerate Washington, D.C. in 13 minutes. Yet, as with so many great crises, discovery came not in a dramatic explosion, but in the grainy black and white of spy plane photographs. On October 14, 1962, an American U-2 reconnaissance plane brought back images of mystery structures. Analysts stared in horror. Missile launch sites. Clear, direct evidence of a Soviet nuclear buildup right at America's doorstep. The morning after, President Kennedy received the intelligence. The world would later remember these days as the moment when the fate of millions hung by a thread. Kennedy convened his closest advisors, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, dubbed ExComm. Heated debates raged. Some, led by the fiery General Curtis LeMay, insisted on preemptive airstrikes and a full-scale invasion. "We don't have any choice except direct military action," LeMay argued, clamoring for strength in the face of Soviet audacity. Others, like Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, argued for restraint. They feared what direct confrontation might unleash, nuclear retaliation on unimaginable scale. Instead, McNamara posed a middle ground, a quarantine, essentially a naval blockade to cut off further shipments while still leaving a door open for diplomacy. Kennedy knew that any path he chose could mean the end of cities, of families, perhaps even of human civilization. On October 22nd, grim-faced, he addressed the nation. For the first time, the American public and the world understood the magnitude of the threat. "It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union," declared Kennedy, a statement that sent shockwaves through every capital. Naval vessels quickly steamed into position, forming a blockade, quarantine line 800 miles from Cuba. Orders were clear and chilling. Soviet ships must turn back or be forcibly boarded. Both sides prepared for the worst. The U.S. went to DEFCON 2, one step from all-out war. American B-52 bombers circled overhead, nuclear payloads loaded. But the throes of crisis are rarely linear. Unknown to the U.S., 4 Soviet submarines lurking near the blockade each carried a nuclear torpedo. Isolated from Moscow, one such submarine, B-59, endured American practice depth charges meant to force it to surface. Its crew, cut off from orders, believed war might have already started. Inside, Captain Valentin Savitsky prepared to launch the nuclear torpedo. Approval required 3 officers. 2 said yes. But Vasily Arkhipov, the lone voice of restraint, refused. His calm amidst the chaos may have averted a planet-ending cataclysm. On the world stage, the United Nations became ground zero for diplomacy. American Ambassador Adlai Stevenson confronted his Soviet counterpart with undeniable photographic evidence. "I am prepared to wait until hell freezes over for your answer," Stevenson thundered, demanding the Soviets admit their clandestine actions. Behind the curtain, diplomacy intensified. A U-2 plane was shot down over Cuba, heightening tensions as XCOM readied for potential airstrikes and invasion. The world seemed hurtling toward oblivion, but in the final hours, the seeds of hope began to sprout. Privately, Robert Kennedy met with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin and offered a secret deal. The United States would remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey, but only if the arrangement remained secret. Publicly, the U.S. would pledge not to invade Cuba in exchange for the withdrawal of Soviet missiles. On October 28th, the world exhaled. Khrushchev accepted the offer, broadcasting his decision on Radio Moscow. Soviet missile crews began dismantling their launch sites. Ships loaded with nuclear hardware set sail for home under the watchful eyes of U.S. verification teams. When the dust finally settled, the world had changed. Direct lines of communication, the now famous red telephone hotline, were installed between Moscow and Washington to prevent future misunderstandings. In 1963, the nations signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, the first of many steps toward arms control. President Kennedy, changed by the terror he'd so narrowly avoided, urged peace at American University. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures. And we are all mortal. Years later, as documents were declassified, new generations discovered how close the world had truly come, how flimsy the line between civilization and obliteration can be. In at least a dozen incidents, a single wrong move could have triggered nuclear war. Today, nuclear arsenals remain, and the lessons of those fateful October days continue to echo. Sometimes, as history shows us, the greatest moments are those where disaster is narrowly averted. When nations step away from the abyss and life for one more day is allowed to go on. Kennedy once said that nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, both sides found a path to resolve their differences without crossing the line into catastrophe. These are the lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis: the fragile nature of peace, the terrifying power of nuclear weapons, and the necessity of tireless diplomacy. For 13 days, humanity stared into the abyss and found a way to step back. Sometimes, the most important events in history aren't the ones you see. They're the ones you never have to. If you enjoyed this historical journey, please support our channel by liking, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Don't miss our upcoming content.